Welcome, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon. Un grand bienvenue au Centre Mondial du Pluralisme. A huge welcome to the Global Center for Pluralism and the first crossover episode of the Aga Khan Foundation Canada Global Reads, hosted here at GCP with the wonderful, indomitable Lyse Doucet, speaking about the finest hotel in Kabul. I'm thrilled that all of you could be with us for, I think, what is Lyse Week in Canada now officially. There's been time in Toronto. It's really wonderful to have all of you with us. I'm going to hand over in a moment to Nurjahan Mawani to give some opening remarks on behalf of the Aga Khan Foundation. But first wanted to acknowledge, as we know, we are here on unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. And we're gathered to talk about a book that tells the story of a country through the walls of a single building. And the building that we're gathered in here itself is a space where we can see the history of this land, from gathering and connection on the banks of the Kichisibi, just outside, to the violence and dispossession of the first peoples of this place. And we can see that history through the founding of this building, originally as the Dominion Archives, then as the War Museum, before it was the Global Center for Pluralism. So our small contribution to that history and to our own understanding as we acknowledge this land was to commission an Indigenous history of the building in partnership with a wonderful Indigenous research firm, Archipel Consulting, called From Sussex Drive to the Kichisibi, which looks at the Indigenous history of this building and the lands surrounding it. We have some copies of it in the lobby. It's available online, and so I would encourage all of you to read it and to reflect on the history of this space. It's something that's been really powerful for all of us in better understanding what this building was and represented, what we want it to represent today as we recommit to reconciliation here in Canada today and tomorrow. So now it's my great pleasure, before we introduce Lyse, to introduce Nurjahan Mawani, who I feel with this crowd may need no introduction, but I'm going to do it anyways. Nurjahan is a lawyer, a public servant, a diplomat, a global Canadian, and probably best known for being an inveterate connector and champion of human rights, of refugee rights, of the rights of women and girls, a great friend to Afghanistan, and a great friend to the Global Center for Pluralism. Your connection to Afghanistan is a long one, beginning in 1992 when you led the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada and oversaw the fast-track system to bring Afghan refugees here to Canada, to being a representative for the Aga Khan Development Network, first in the Kyrgyz Republic and then, of course, in Afghanistan from 2012. There are many, many awards and honors, which I'm not going to go through because we don't have the time. But Nurjahan is a senior fellow at Massey College, a great friend to us at the Global Center, to Pluralism, and to Afghanistan. And so we're really grateful, Nurjahan, for you to take the time to come here, make some opening remarks on behalf of Khalil Sharif, the CEO of AKFC, who unfortunately wasn't able to be with us tonight. So Nurjahan, please, over to you.
Oh. So bonjour, good afternoon, everyone. I'm not sure we are still in the afternoon. We don't want to let this disappear. And thank you very much, Meredith. And it's a privilege to welcome you to this special, as Meredith described it, as Aga Khan Foundation Canada's Global Reads event. But it is the first ever crossover, which was new for me, with the Global Center for Pluralism. And I'm doing this on behalf of Khalil Sharif, who can't be here. And in a way, I mean, of course, we are missing him, but look, it's given me the opportunity. So Global Reads is a space where ideas and stories connect us across borders, where we listen to authors who challenge us to care about the world, its complexities, its injustices, and above all, its peoples. And today we turn our attention to a place close to our hearts, Afghanistan. Afghanistan matters. It has mattered to Canada and to Canadians for a long time, not just as a site of geopolitics, but as a place where we've tried in earnest to support hope, build systems, and walk alongside Afghans through extraordinarily difficult times. It's why today is especially meaningful, as it is a chance to reflect not only on Afghanistan, but also on the people who have shaped our understanding of it. Lyse Doucet, who we are honored to have with us today, is one of those remarkable people. Lyse and I first met in Kabul at the Serena Hotel. Some would say the other finest hotel. You knew that would come, right? Where many of us crossed paths with journalists, ministers, and civil society leaders alike. Over the years, Lyse and I spent time together there, reflecting on the unfolding stories of the country, the warmth and the hospitality of the Afghan people, and the beauty of its culture. Over cups of green tea, saffron tea, and Serena's famous offerings, we watched ministers and civil society leaders pass through. We conferred, we reflected, and yes, we conspired, but in a good way, to try and make sense of the moment and imagine something better. Lyse conducted interviews from Serena's rooftop, broadcast to the world from its halls, and never shied away from capturing the human cost of conflict. Her storytelling reminds us why places matter, not only in the memories they hold, but in what they make possible. From health facilities like the French Medical Institute for Mothers and Children in Kabul to the Bamiyan Provincial Hospital, supported through Canadian partnerships, and both, which I am happy to tell you, continue to provide right now to provide high quality health services to thousands of people in Afghanistan. Then we go to Baghe Babur, a public garden beautifully restored by the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. And those of you, when you get to the book, will see a reference to the Baghe Babur in there. And once again, a place of memory and peace. These are not just symbols. They are testament to what commitment, collaboration, and hope can build. Afghanistan is a place where Canada has a long history of engagement. And even now, amidst global pressures and competing priorities, we are reminded that this connection must not fade. The work of the Aga Khan Development Network, which I had the honor to represent for several years in Afghanistan, began in early 1990s. It began with delivering food aid, essential food aid, during a period of civil war. Since 2002, with Canadian support and the involvement of other partners, this work has expanded to various fields, including humanitarian, economic, social, and cultural areas, and it remains operating in 7 provinces in the country. And today, more than 10,000 Afghans have joined us in this effort. Over 200 health centers, hospitals, clinics continue to serve communities thanks to those foundational investments in health systems, including postgraduate medical education, midwifery, nursing by Canada, by France, and the AKDN. This was not a short-term intervention. It's a long-term commitment, generational, I would submit, and its impact continues to be felt today. The Afghan women and men who were empowered through it, continue to contribute, not only within Afghanistan, but across the region and across the world. At a time when many are saying we must move on, I hope this afternoon reminds us that there is always more beneath the surface. Lyse's storytelling brings us closer to that deeper truth, to that quiet, enduring strength and capacity of the Afghan peoples, and to the lives that continue with courage and purpose, despite immense challenges. Many of the seeds planted with Canadian and Acadian support in health, in education, infrastructure, civil society, continue to grow, nurtured by Afghans who have not given up. This capacity and commitment to supporting the thriving of Afghan communities is also reflected in the work of the Global Center for Pluralism, which has recognized 3 remarkable Afghan organizations through its Global Pluralism Awards: the Afghan National Music Institute of Music, Art Lords Afghanistan, and a New Life Trust. Lyse, you have spent decades helping us to see not only what is happening, but why it matters, through the depth, clarity, and humanity which you bring to every story. Your work in Afghanistan has shaped global understanding, and today it is our privilege to reflect with you. You're not only a journalist of the highest integrity, but a dear friend and an enduring witness to the peoples and possibilities of Afghanistan. So I'm truly delighted, and I say on behalf of us all, to welcome you to this special afternoon. And a great Canadian in conversation with our own Meredith, Preston McGhie, the Secretary General of the Global Center for Pluralism. Thank you. Merci. Tashakur.
You can hear me? Excellent. Welcome. Oh, I feel so welcome. Thank you very much, Noor Jahan. I think I speak for almost everyone here. When we meet with Noor Jahan, we feel we're meeting en famille, because you have this way of embracing all of us. And because I'm here with the Noor Jahan family, I'm wearing one of the many jackets that Noor Jahan has gifted to me. She has this way. She goes, "Why don't you try this on, Lisa? I just want to see whether this fits you." And then she'll say, "Yes, keep it." And oh, there's a red one too. Try it on. Well, no, you keep it. You keep it. One of her many acts. I like how she decided the Aga Khan Development Foundation should also include the BBC correspondent, so in humanitarian development. And to you, Meredith, I love the way that you began our conversation here today among friends and family, is that recognizing the space and such a special place, and the effort you've gone to understand what has gone before us, and to remind us about how spaces do carry memories and that history lives within the walls. And I'm hoping that our conversation today can be a kind of memory that we will all cherish, that we can move the conversation on. And in the same way that you acknowledged the ancestors whose land we have the privilege to be on today, I want to acknowledge before I discuss with you a book about Afghanistan and a conversation with all of you, could the Afghans who have joined us today please raise their hand? Are there any Afghan? Good. Oh,
Let's hear.
very nice. Koshamad and Koshamad. Oh, salam, salam, salam. Thank you. Oh, salam. Oh, look, thank you. Tashakor, tashakor. I speak for all of us that we have felt your pain, and there are many here, in fact, almost everyone here, who has helped to ease your pain of the dislocation, the upset, the setbacks, the pain of what has happened recently in Afghanistan. And I think we all dare to hope with you that Afghanistan will, as has been happened all too often in Afghanistan, that the country will change again and be a country for all Afghans. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. I actually might start with you there. And again, thank you so much for agreeing to take the time. I know you are on a whirlwind tour, but when Lisa and I were talking about this discussion, part of it really was because we believe, and I think you believe, in the power of literature to build empathy and understanding. And those are really foundational tenets for pluralism to take root anywhere. And I was remarking with a colleague recently about the challenge of having empathy in today's world, that it's hard. And she remarked that we are sometimes asked to have ever expanding circles of empathy to a point where we feel almost that it collapses in on itself and we just can't do it. And so often that comes from headlines rather than deeper human understandings of the realities of what's happened. Too often we scroll on the BBC app, of course, because that's the only one we use, that we scroll and we only see the headlines and we don't dive in more deeply. And so I really wanted to get in with you about why this book in this moment. And maybe to start, you may want to read a passage to kick us off. And really, in this moment when it can feel like the world is turned away from Afghanistan, that the world has given up. We have an Afghan laureate this year, as was mentioned, for our awards, who couldn't get a visa to come to Canada to accept the award. And so that feels like the doors of the country are shut from the outside to us. And so I wonder if you might want to reflect a little bit about why this book now, when there is this feeling that maybe Afghanistan has been forgotten or turned away by so many.
I think that would, the Afghans who are with us today are far too polite to say that to us, but I think among Afghans, there is a sense in which they have been forgotten, and you have reason to believe it. And when I'm often asked, and I'm sure everyone in this room, or many of you in this room, often think about it, what can I do? What can I do to help change the situation? And I often say that sometimes it's the smallest of things, even taking time to know what's happening in Afghanistan, taking time to care about Afghanistan. I was really struck last night at the Ottawa Writers Festival. A woman who heads a midwife organization said, I'm trying to work with midwives in Afghanistan. Someone put his hand up and said, we're setting up a virtual university, medical university for women in Afghanistan. Many people said, came with Afghan friends and said, we did everything to bring this family here. And we all are big believers in it doesn't have to be all necessarily from state to state or, the huge movements. It can be the tiniest acts of kindness that can make a difference. And may I pick up as well on the fact that your award winner couldn't be with you for his award. I was hoping that this week my dear Afghan friend and colleague Mahfouz Zubaydi would be with me. And if you read the acknowledgements in the book, someone from Penguin is here and they've instructed me, don't say if you read the book. You're supposed to say when you read the book. But trying to be polite, I'll say if and when you read the book, or still your friends. The acknowledgements begin by saying I couldn't have written this book without working with Mahfouz Zubaydi. I've spent a lot of time in Afghanistan. I've spent a lot of time in this hotel, but I'm not Afghan. And I love that expression by our great Canadian novelist Robertson Davies about what's bred in the bone. What we have, we carry our ancestry with us. And of course, I'm Canadian. So it was really important for me that I have an Afghan working with me, not just to translate from Dari and Pashto, but to help to interpret the emotions and experiences of Afghans living through these most tumultuous of times. My sister Andrew, who's a research scholar, is here, and I kept saying, Andrew, do you think it's okay? Do you think this is not going to be seen, as we say in Canada, cultural appropriation? Is there a way to do it? Because again, it's trying to move beyond the kind of storytelling. It's such a beautiful word, but the kind of the reports that we do in news are such a small snapshot of what happens in a person's life, even in the hardest and darkest of times. And it's to go beyond those hardest of moments and to try to let in people into the lives of people who, at the end of the day, I always see my task as a foreign correspondent is to try to narrow the differences between you and I, that there are these human experiences that bind us together. Of course, the situations in places like Afghanistan, Sudan, Gaza now are beyond our imagination. They're unbearable and illegal and the worst affront to all of our values. But people do have to find a way to get up in the morning and to carry on. So it is this power of stories. The desire for stories begins as soon as we're born, after our mother's milk. What is it that children say? Read me a story. Read me a story. Once upon a time, not so long ago, we all grow up with the love of stories, and we shouldn't give it up just because we're grown up now.
And the stories in this book are really delightful. I didn't bring my reading glasses up, so you'll forgive me if I maybe ask you to read this passage, which I think sort of sets the the stage really nicely, beginning from history. I've been studying really hard.
You could see when she was going to school that she would be in the front seat going, Miss.
But I also have to say that I have had the pleasure of knowing Lyse for a very long time, being on many, many stages at the Oslo Forum and other places. And Lyse is always the best prepared moderator ever. And so I couldn't simply let her down.
This is sort of almost a little, I'll just read a little bit about it. In a land where most Afghans worried whether they would see their next meal or their next day, the intercon was a constant. Through moments of heartrending uncertainty and suffering, its receptionists kept smiling, waiters kept serving, cooks kept pots on the boil, cleaners snapped sheets across beds, bellboys kept lugging luggage up and down the stairs when the lifts were broken or the electricity was cut. The hotel became their mislechana, like their own home. History always moves in a multitude of singular stories that carry far bigger truths. Afghanistan's story tells us that war is more than the blast of bombs, the whistle of bullets. It's a mother's anxious eyes, the song of a soldier, a soul-soothing camaraderie, the pause before going out the door. It plays out on the front lines of everyday life, in dashed dreams, wrecked weddings, and the courage of people who hold each other close and do what they can to carry on.
What I love about that is that it talks about the ordinary stories and that life really existed within the hotel. You were saying about the sort of the journalists in the story of the day, and so I wonder, I'd be interested in how this has been different for you to be an author compared to being a journalist. I think a lot of us are getting our everyday news about Afghanistan and other places, Sudan, Gaza, from the news, not from being able to spend time with characters in books like this. So how is that different for you as a process, becoming an author from being a journalist?
How many people here have already written books? Oh, there you go. See? Yes. I know some people are natural. I had to learn how to write a book, and I had a very, very good editor, and those of you who have written books know that a good editor is gold dust. And I summarize the process by referring to that great achievement in Western literature that has defined all of our early lives, and that is Goldilocks and the Three Bears. When I first wrote a draft and I sent it to my editor, he said, "Oh, Lyse, that's too short. It's not an online article for the BBC. You need more detail. The chapters have to be longer." So then I wrote it again. And then he said, "Lyse, that's too long. That's too much history. Do you have to have all those coups? There's too many coups in Afghanistan. They're going to get coup whiplash. And 3 dresses on the wedding day. Can't you just have 2 dresses?" And then, like Goldilocks, we found something in the middle. Hopefully, if and when you buy the book, just enough history to tell the story, just enough detail to keep you reading the story, and a lot of what these, I don't want to say characters, the people in this book and their stories, their individual stories, the story of Hotel, which is in so many ways is a conceit, is a prism to see a wider history of Afghanistan. And as you mentioned, literature has this great power to expand our horizons and hopefully to expand our empathy. And when I first started traveling after I finished graduate school at the University of Toronto, I always turned to novels and to what we call narrative history. Marie-Joëlle is in the front seat nodding. She's also a front seat girl too. To immerse, to have a better understanding of getting into people's lives, their culture, what matters to them in life. And so when I started writing, I would sometimes stop myself and say, well, why am I writing it like this? And I realized that it was the only way I thought could be the kind of storytelling to try, I hoped, to draw people in. But of course, I'm a journalist, and there's aspects of journalism which are almost physical. If I was to write a book, and I won't, you're my witness, about journalism, I would call it the pang. Because when something happens, you feel it here, like it's a physical reaction. I want to be there. Something's happening on the ground. And similarly, in this book, when I would find myself tapping away and then read a little bit of dialogue and embroidering here, and I would say, stop it, go back and read the transcripts. What did Abida say? What did she say she did? And Afghans are such natural storytellers, and they've often been described as poets, that they were a gift to a first-time author in terms of the stories they told, in terms of how these are people which, of course, upend our stereotypes. Abida, illiterate, no formal education. Malalai, no formal education. Most of them, not very much formal education. But they could tell stories, and their memory was a marvel.
And I think, as you mentioned before, it's so interesting also being able to be non-Afghan with Afghans, sort of sharing those stories through the hotel. And I think that there's something really powerful about that, about the external eye also being able to pull some of these stories out and create something. I often talk with Sudanese colleagues about this Goldilocks zone of complexity, that it does need to be, it is more complex than often people think. But if you think it's so complicated that it's impossible, then people won't engage. So you do have to find this balance in between. And I think the hotel tells that really well. And so I wanted to dive into a couple pieces about the hotel because I think it's so interesting as a sort of a tool in the book. So the hotel for me showed a few kind of contradictions in the narration in a positive way. And one was that you were telling daily stories. You were telling the stories of ordinary people living their lives through the walls of the hotel, but at the same time, you were telling the stories of the Soviet invasion, right? Christmas of '79. You were talking about the Mujahideen in '92. You were talking about the Taliban first coming into power. You were talking about the Loya Jirga that was happening in the walls of the hotel. So the big historic events were happening next door to the daily lives. And I was wondering if that was sort of how deliberate that was, and sort of how you were thinking about that space in terms of both telling the history of Afghanistan, but telling the history also of some Afghans in that moment.
Because all of us, no matter where we live, it's what happens to us, to our loved ones, to those near and dear, that even in the midst of momentous times, what's happening in what's closest to us in our own life is what matters most of all. So the days when Afghanistan hit the headlines on August the 15th, 2021, when suddenly, or not so suddenly, Kabul collapsed and the Taliban returned to power, there was no headline anywhere in the world which said, well, there was a wedding at a hotel in Kabul that was shattered by the Taliban coming to Kabul. But when I went to the hotel shortly afterwards, the Afghan staff that were there was and the waiters and who'd been working in the ballroom, that was the story they wanted to tell me. They said, Lyse, for the first time, there was a wedding in the ballroom, and the bride didn't change from her green dress into her white dress. And we served the lunch quick, and everyone went home. Everyone ran home in a panic because the Taliban were coming to Kabul. And the Taliban coming was the second most important story. The hotel was reeling that they were all, did you see the bride? She ran away in tears. We never saw that before in the hotel.
Nobody ate the food.
And nobody ate the food. The food went to waste. Because that is their world. And that was for them, it was strong. Of course it mattered that the Taliban were coming to power, but in their day-to-day rituals, in the same way that when the first time the Taliban came to power, and the hotel was on an edge with the Mujahideen leaders going to leave, they're worried about whether they should serve tea or coffee to the legendary Afghan commander Ahmed Shah Massoud, who's at the hotel looking out with his binoculars, trying to see if the Taliban in 1996 are coming to Kabul. It is the rituals, the rituals and routines of daily life that all of us, that's lives lived.
But it's also the adaptation that as things change, you adapt. You find a way to change what you're serving on the menu or what have you. But the change in adaptation, the other thing that was really interesting to me in terms of the stories of the hotel, especially from the very beginning, when it is French patisserie and bikinis around the pool and these sorts of things, to the moments with both the Mujahideen and the Taliban and so forth, was this question of the tension of social norms of Afghanistan. That this was a space where a lot of Western so-called norms were situated almost from the beginning, with this being a five-star international hotel with so-called Western standards in Kabul, sort of sitting on the edge of the hill. And then these waves of the very, very traditional so-called views coming in, and everything in between in the stories. You mentioned Shukriya Baradzai, I think, at one point, and others, those moments of tension. And I was wondering if you could just reflect a little bit on that from in the hotel, but also for Afghanistan more generally, because I think we feel obviously the pendulum has swung very, very far in one direction. But I wondered as I was reading the book, was there something that could have been done differently in terms of how social change was happening that could have prevented, mitigated some of the backlash that we see now?
This, there are geographers who say that the great differences across the world are not between countries, although the divisions are wide and getting wider, but it's within countries, between the city and the countryside, between the urban areas and the more traditional. I don't want to use the word backward, less developed areas. And this, you could tell, the history of Afghanistan has been written in that way. But before I comment on that, let me just tell you a story about how I first approached it when I went to the hotel in 2020 and was meeting some of the Afghans I'd known for decades, or meeting some who I'd known a bit, but not in great detail. And one of the ones was 70-some Hazrat, who's the character, the person in the book who spans the entire 50 years. And he would tell to anyone who would listen, and even if you didn't want to listen, that he had been trained by the proper intercontinental hotel. And every time the rulers changed in Afghanistan, the rules also changed to the intercon, because it's a government-owned hotel. And he would impress upon them that he was the person to ask, because he knew everything. But when I approached him and said, I'm thinking of writing a history of the hotel. Would you like to be part of it? He told me his first story. He mimicked, he remembered. He did the gesture of nonchalantly throwing over his shoulder a white, soft, plush towel. And this was the wealthy tourist in their white shirt and skirts and shorts, gliding across the marble floor on the way to the tennis courts or to the swimming pool. And that for him oozed this life of ease and privilege, and a world completely different from his own. But when he told me that story, it was not to say, look at these people, they're so rich, and look at my life. God has not been so kind to me. No, he was, I was trained as an intercontinental waiter. I was working in this finest hotel, and it is my honor to be a highly trained professional in this hotel. So I was so struck by the dignity with which they carry themselves. And there was another character Kudus, who I really wanted to be in the book. And he had stepped through the door of the hotel September 10th, 1969, as a junior tailor. And he had this little black mustache that made him look like Peter Sellers. And like all Afghans, he had a joke tugging at his cheeks, because Afghans have this marvelous sense of humor. And so I knew he was going to start, tell me something to make me laugh even before he did. And so I would start laughing as soon as I saw him. And I said, "Oh, Kudus, I really would like you to be in the book." And what I was also struck by Kudus is when they had started working as teenagers or in their early 20s, they would bicycle to work. They'd bicycle up the pine-covered hill to go to work, and then they'd bicycle back down. And then when I reunited with them again decades later, and they were in their 50s and 60s, they were still bicycling up the pine-covered hill to work and bicycling back down. And by then, 2022, Kabul was awash with luxury SUVs, bulletproof sedans. And here it was, and I was washed with this sense of such honest, hardworking people that didn't have the income of these people. And of course, they were scathing about some of the corruption in the city, but the way they were still living their lives, but still bicycling in and then putting on their intercontinental waiter's jacket and their bow tie. But yes, if you rise above that, in every stage of Afghan history, there is the city versus the provinces. And in particular, in 1992, when those of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the period of the Cold War, when the Western-backed Mujahideen toppled the Soviet-backed government in Kabul, then you have the Mujahideen fighters coming to take power in Kabul and then coming to take over the hotel. And the clash begins right at the revolving door because they'd never seen a revolving door before. And so the dozen of them rush headlong into this door, into the glass, with the rocket launchers on one side, the Kalashnikov on the other, and being Afghan, laughing and hooting and stuck in the door, and then shooting and then smashing their way through the glass. And on the other side are the staff, the more educated staff, watching in horror. And it would have been, and then of course, then they get out of the revolving door and meet the lifts. And of course, these are people who'd never gone to the second floor of anything. They lived in mud houses. They lived in a countryside devastated by Soviet carpet bombing. And if they ever went to the second floor, it was with a rickety ladder to the roof. And so you press the button and the gold doors open. And then you go inside this mirrored cabin and you press it again, it brings you to another floor. And it would be so easy to say, and they laughed at it. But of course, I was very clear not to laugh at it, to be comic, because this was a microcosm of the distorted development, but also the decades of war that they never had the opportunity for many of them not to go to school, to have the luxury of flicking on a switch and the electricity comes, turning the tap and the water comes down. And so those kind of tensions, time and again, did fuel. I mean, in the case of the time during the Cold War, it was, of course, the anger against the Soviet occupation, the infidels, the people who had come, the foreigners taking over the country, and abusing their traditional beliefs, their Islamic beliefs. So there was other things involved in it as well. But you did have this collision time and again, and it was witnessed time and again inside the hotel.
And you talk a bit as well about that, specifically around the women of the hotel. And Abida's story in it, when you all read the book, it's lovely. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about her. But before that, you also talk a little bit about the Afghan Star competition. And I just finished watching a reality show that I'm obsessed with that I won't get into. But
Traitors?
Yes. Celebrity traitors. But the Afghan Star is as a music competition, as a singing competition, I guess, like The Voice or Pop Idol, so forth, for Afghanistan. But this being something where the staff of the hotel were some obsessed with watching this and having their favorites, and
like 11 million other Afghans. Yes,
exactly. But then at the same time, death threats and a sense that this was a corruption of Afghan culture, particularly for women taking the stage.
Yes, you had these great contradictions in Afghanistan's development, and there's many people here. There were Lyse is here, who was ambassador in Afghanistan, and UN envoy Nur Jahan. Was there a number of you were? Of course, the Afghans who are here know this better than any of us, and that every country has to develop at the pace in which it is ready to develop. And we've already touched on the contradictions and the deep divide, economically, politically, socially, materially, in Afghan society. And that could lead us into a discussion about what happens then when foreign countries come in and don't understand that there is this duality or this multipolarity of a society that has to develop at its own pace and in its own time. And you had this, in effect, when the Taliban were toppled in 2001, in many ways, Afghanistan, even Kabul, went from the last century to the next century. A country with no telephone lines suddenly had the best in mobile telephone lines. And suddenly young Afghans were embracing all these new opportunities. It was a dizzying time. It was a hopeful time. But the rest of the country was not keeping up. But I have to say that urban centers, Mazar-i-Sharif and Jalalabad and Herat, Kandahar in a certain way, in the urban centers, young Afghans again were embracing. They were setting up English language schools, computer schools. I was dazzled when I would go around to the provinces and see these young Afghans. We have this expression that the great American anthropologist Louis Dupre called Afghans maximizers, and it's that seizing of opportunities in the moment. But of course, not all the country was. It was still a deeply conservative culture, which was, shocked and angered by what was happening. The accusations very on, even from President Karzai, I mean, especially from President Karzai, that, Afghan Idol was scandalous, that we can't run these Bollywood movies, scantily dressed with, we can't have drinking, we can't have, and in some ways the Western community, as well as Westernized Afghans who'd come from abroad, were part of the problem of the growing tensions and the huge gap in incomes. And this is where we, as people who come from outside, that come from a ways, as we say in Canada, have also the responsibility to bear in what eventually happened, and should give us humility that when we go into a country and a culture which is not our own, we have to go carefully, and we have to be led and learn from the people who will always know the country more than we can ever do.
And I think there's really something when you think about the complexity, I think of what you try to do with the characters in here is also that those contradictions of the society exist inside the people, like individuals themselves. And Abida was so interesting to me because she's groundbreaking in getting to work in the kitchen I think first as a sous chef, and really you have a wonderful line in there that an Afghan woman has changed the menu. And that she really changed the hotel through her perseverance, but through her mastery of traditional Afghan food, not French patisserie, but also that she herself was very traditional, but moving towards the modernity as well. And there's a wonderful set of contradictions about her that are very much how all of us live. All of us are a muddled set of contradictory identities that we manage in our lives. So I didn't know if you wanted to sort of expand a bit for the audience on her story,
this
especially.
Is something that, and perhaps some of our Afghan friends here can talk about these dualities, and maybe it's something that we all deal with no matter where we live. We try to remain true and rooted in our own traditions while still seizing the best that the world has to offer us. And in those 2 decades of international engagement, there were these new opportunities for all the mistakes that were made, and there were many mistakes both by the international community, including Canada, as well as Afghans. There were also these new opportunities, that there was foreign managers at the Intercontinental Hotel, that there was new investment in the hotel, which allowed Abida, who'd been forced to stay at home during the Taliban and the Mujahideen time, where she then became a seamstress instead of a cook, and then she could be Abida Nazari, single mother, widowed, lost her husband to a rocket, and misery upon misery. Then her daughter lost her husband to a rocket, single mother. But Abida was able, 8 children, she educated 6 of them to university level, and she was able to go back to the hotel. And they said to her, after they were totally taken by her delicious ashak and mantu that they'd never even heard of. And then they said, well, we have one more question to ask you. And she said, yes. They said, do you mind working with men? And she said, I worked with men in the Hotel Kabul kitchen, and she changed the menu. She put Afghan food on the menu, but she found her place in that kitchen and really imposed, when she thought it wasn't working right, they tried to put a bakery to bake the bread in her kitchen. No way. The bread has to be baked out there. You're not going to have bread in my kitchen. I'm making ashak and mantu. The bread will be, too much noise, too much the scent of the bread. Take it outside. So it was very easy for us to put people into boxes. She was a woman who's illiterate, can't read, can't write. Life never gave her that opportunity. Her superpower is in her hands, and yet she has a force when it matters to her. She does speak her mind, and her superpower was also in raising her children. And yes, she loved Afghan Star. She couldn't wait to get home and sit around like so many Afghans and vote. But she was also deeply religious and deeply traditional. And her life was one of trying to deal with the sickness in her families, and also with many. She didn't have a luxurious life. She had a very hard life, and yet
She
she
was
still
also a
found
leader. But she was a leader.
leader.
She was a
Yes,
leader of her family. She was a
yes.
leader in that kitchen.
Mm,
And I think it's a reminder as well that it isn't just victimhood
mm,
in these spaces. There's agency and
yeah.
there's power within these spaces. And I think you
Mm,
tell that really
yeah.
beautifully.
And one of the most had many moving moments with Abid about one day when she was speaking about her life and all that she'd been through and how she was still getting up to work and coming to work every day, and she was proud of her children. And she said, if I could read and write, I would write a book about my life. And I thought, well, if I, when I finally get to Kabul again, her photograph is in the book, that she will feel that I have done justice to her story, and that her story now is something for her. When the book is translated into Dari and Pashto, it's something that she can have as a record of her own life. And of course, we all wish that she could write her own book, but of course, sadly, that wasn't going to happen. Although I have to say that I work with someone in London, Lucy Hanna, who's got an initiative called Untold Narratives. I don't know whether you know about it. And she's helped Afghan women writers, not because they're Afghan, but because they're writers, they're authors, and they want to be treated as authors. Yes, they live in Afghanistan. Yes, they are women writers, but they're not always going to write about poverty and war. Sometimes they're going to write about bright red shoes and about things they want, the happy moments in their lives. They're not going to be pigeonholed into writing the things that you want you think Afghan women should write. So there are these initiatives, just as a parenthesis, to allow Afghans to tell their own story. And I should say, if you have the chance, Mandana Hendesi has written a beautiful book called The Almond Garden, which is about Badambag, the Almond Garden, which is the women's prison in Kabul. And it is so exquisitely written. And she has found in one of the darkest places in Kabul women thrown into prison for so-called abandoning their husbands and living with all of the darkness that there is in that kind of a prison. And wow, their defiance, their power, the way they get through the day, the way they find hope, the way they fight back is truly inspiring. And it's a real page turner of a book. So I'm going to promote her book here, and I'll tell her I did.
Books on Beechwood, you guys can stock it. I want to ask you one more question. Then we want to make sure we have a bit of time for questions from the audience as well. And so I think, as you recall from the session that we did in London earlier this year, is that we have to end on hope. And because hope is how we all act. That if we think this is hard and complicated, we all go to bed and pull the covers over our heads. And the end of your book, I have to be really frank, did make me cry. And it is sad to see that arc and where Afghanistan has found itself right now. It is hard to find some hope in some of that. And so I just wanted to push you on sort of where you see hope and where all of us should see hope and act to help move things towards a brighter future.
We have to be so careful, especially all of us here, so privileged to live the lives that we do. None of us would say we live perfect lives. Many of us might want to live different kinds of lives, but we live in a democracy. We're all educated. No one stopped us at grade 6 from pursuing our education, male or female. So we don't really we have many privileges, but I don't think we have the privilege not to be hopeful for other people, because they're not giving up hope. In the case of Afghanistan, they say that hope is the last to die, and some Afghans have come to me and said, "Lyse, our hope has died. This is the darkest period that we've ever been through." And even if the thread of Afghan history is that history always changes, and changes, as historians like to say, at the last minute, suddenly the bouleversement of everything's turned upside down, that many are finding it hard to think, when will this, the darkest of periods, ever change? That it's hard to be hopeful, and yet these same people who struggle to find hope are out there now, and it's been more than 4 years, and the Afghans in the diaspora, and I won't speak for those who are here, hopefully you will, they're now picking themselves up, and human rights activists who were really prominent in Afghanistan are now building human rights organizations outside. Women parliamentarians are connecting with governments and places, and all of us can do what we can to connect the dots. I often quote David Miliband, and some of you may know, former Foreign Secretary, now head of the IRC, and he says, when you see the statistics, they can make you depressed. But when you meet the people on the ground, they give you hope. And even in places where, as I said, hope is hard to find, to give up hope is to give up on the world moving in a different direction. Giving up hope is, I feel, for all of us, is giving up being human. Because what fuels hope? Hope is fueled by what we know about the world, but hope is also fueled by what we hope for the world, by heart, by our feelings as well. And so to give up on hope is to give up on being human.
And I think your book so beautifully reminds us about what it is to be human in Kabul through the stories in this hotel. And I think that does make it easier for people to have that hope, because they can feel the very human connection to the people that are represented in this book.
Yeah, the Afghans don't need us, or the people of Sudan or the people of Gaza. They don't need us to make them human. They're as human as they can be. But we can, to circle back to where we started, through the power of literature, through the power of caring, that we ourselves can look at the world through a different prism.
And you mentioned human rights activists who are abroad, and I would also just have to say that Maiwand Rahab really wanted to be here with you. Of course, he has established resilient societies here in Canada, so a great example of that. He's at Berlin at Freedom Week this week, where I know a number of activists are there, but obviously sends you his very good wishes for this discussion. We do have some time for a few questions from the audience. Jane is looking at her watch and mouthing, very little time, you've talked too much. But maybe we'll take a couple questions and let you reflect back on them, because we need time for Lyse to sign some books for all of you. So if there are maybe just one or two hands, and we've got one here, two. Okay, we'll take these two quick questions. Yeah, you can take my microphone, and then Lyse, you can reflect back on those, and then we'll wrap up.
The Afghans would like to take the floor, not to single you out, but.
At your talk last night, you mentioned the young sector of the Taliban, and that they were more modern thinking and progressive than the elders. And there was a percentage you gave of who the elders were. Could you talk about that a little bit more? I don't think we hear a lot about that in Western media.
We'll take both questions. Okay.
Thank you so much. You mentioned the pang that you feel.
Do people mind identifying themselves?
Sure. My name is Juliette Gundy. I work at Global Affairs Canada. Mm-hmm. You mentioned the pang that you feel when it's time to perhaps start the journey to a new assignment. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about sort of what that pang is saying to you, and the process that you go through to prepare for perhaps returning to Kabul, for instance, at so many times in your career. And is it difficult to step away when it's time to go?
I use the quote, and some of you may know Mullah Zaif, who was the Taliban ambassador to Pakistan when the events of September 11th happened, and he wrote a book called My Life as a Talib. Sadly, he was sent to Guantanamo Bay, but still he tries now to work for dialogue. And when I saw him in Kabul 2 years ago, he said 95% of the Taliban, he's a founding member of the Taliban, don't agree with the harshest of edicts. Yes, we're a traditional society, we're very conservative, We believe that certain rules have to be, but we know that Islam gives girls the right to be educated. We know that Islam allows women to pursue their potential. And I remember when I put that on social media, a lot of Afghans replied and mocked him and said, look at you, 95%, and you can't do anything to get rid of the ultra-conservative leaders, the emirs at the top, who are promulgating, at last count, 70, 80 restrictions, most of them against women and girls, almost every week. Now they're reinforcing the burqa again, even though they promised they wouldn't, at least in some areas. But because Afghanistan has been torn time and again by armed groups, and because the Taliban want to remain in power, they believe that loyalty, they give an oath of allegiance, a bayat to the emir. But there have been Taliban leaders who have left. The person, Sanaksai, who was the head of the negotiating team in Doha in 2020, he has said to leave Kabul because he constantly spoke out about the need for education of girls. And, all of us, and I'm sure there are many in this room who keep their ear to the ground. What are you hearing? Are they going to convince the leader to change his mind? They don't want to respond to pressure. Even, it has to be said, the pressure of, there has been a succession of Islamic leaders, Islamic scholars who've gone to Afghanistan to say you are violating the principles of Islam. I went with Amina Mohammed, who's Nigerian British, and she went to talk to the Taliban leaders, hadith to hadith, text to text, and she came out and I said, so what did you learn from talking to the most conservative of the Taliban? And she said, they really believe that Islam talks about protecting women, and that they are protecting women by keeping them in the house. You don't have to leave. We'll go out and do everything for you. And that they actually believe that. And again, it's a measure of, the leaders have never left Afghanistan. They live in a closed world. And finally, I would say that Mullah Saif, in his book, there was one line which really struck me. He said, during our first time in power in the 90s, we did not have the education to make a deal with the world. In other words, we came from the villages, and he had fought, not much. He actually educated himself, speaks several languages. They'd fought against the Soviets. They were educated in the madrasas of Pakistan. They didn't understand the ways of the world. But of course, fast forward, including the years of international engagement, they began to understand about the United Nations, about human rights, about the rights of women, and while still holding to their traditions. He was one of the ones who said, we have to move with the times while still remaining loyal to. But so there are there's these glimmers of hope, but it hasn't happened yet. But there are things that people focus on them as possibly a way forward.
And this question about your journalistic
You really want to know about the
pangs.
pang. We sometimes curse the pang because you think, oh, my sister's getting married. Do I really want to go to Afghanistan? What's the opportunity cost of this pang about being there at the right place at the right time? Maybe I will say that for journalists like me, and I'm a member of a very big tribe, so this is not just about me, but there are a lot of journalists, and especially in my generation, who don't go to a place once. We keep going back and forth and back and forth, so that if the BBC says, would you like to go to Kabul? I'm not thinking about, oh, this is a story, a news that I'll have to do. I think about the friends I will see, the places I will go, the food I will eat. And it's the same for Jerusalem, for Amman, for Abidjan, for any of the places where I've lived for years and keep going back time and again. So it's threaded through life. Other words, in terms of preparation, I mostly always travel with a kettle, Yorkshire tea, good and strong, soya milk, gluten-free bread. And when there was the when there was the invasion of Iraq in 2003, I went to Jordan with a toaster.
My British husband will absolutely approve that you travel with Yorkshire tea, which is what we have in our kitchen here as well. Lyse, journalists give us these windows on the things that are happening today and that happened yesterday. And this book, I think, really beautifully takes all of those journalistic windows and weaves them together into something that is so much deeper and so much more about the humans and the complexity that inhabits this space. And for me, it's just been a real gift to read it. And I think it is just, it's a gift for all of us who want Afghanistan to be better understood so that we can all more effectively stand in solidarity with the people of Afghanistan on their journey going forward. So I just want to say a huge thank you to you for writing this book and for spending this time with us.
You know, I think I think I speak for all of us in this room. It is a very hard time. I think a lot of us are. I won't say I can't speak for all of you, but I would wager that it is a time which is challenging all of the values and norms that we hold dear. Yes, the world has been convulsed generation after generation by wars, by man-made and natural disasters, but we live in a time where now we call them forever wars, and that the rules of war enshrined in the Geneva Conventions, which came out of the horrors of the Second World War, are being violated on an industrial scale. And yet, here we are. I always use this Dickensian, the best of times and the worst of times. Never has our technology been so good. Never has our understanding of international human rights organizations, never have local human rights organizations, our understanding of law been so good. But never has the impunity been so bad. And our inability, men and women, however people identify gender, of goodwill with resources and troops aren't able to put the pieces back together again and stop the wars. And so my way of dealing with that was to try to write a book, to try to look at the world in a different way. And everyone here in this room, I'm sure, is trying to find a different way to engage with the world, because everyone in this room is here and in this glorious, this special space because they believe they can, however big or small, make a little difference in moving this world forward, lest we lose even more.
And you know, when we talk about pluralism, that's one of our biggest messages, is that it's a big word and a big idea, but it is a series of individual acts. And the things that do change are human to human acts every day. And sometimes I think when we think about society, it is this huge thing, but it is us. And my wand actually said something publicly the other day that I really loved. And he said, when governments hesitate, civil society has to act. And I thought that was a good reminder that it does feel like the systems are paralyzed by the awfulness, but that means it is up to all of us. And so I guess it's time for us to find our way to do that. And you've done it just beautifully in this book and with your journalism. And we love you and thank you so much for being with us. Thank you all. And I would invite you all to buy the book, to visit, to have nibbles. We have refreshments outside, so stay, enjoy the hospitality, enjoy the company of one another, and thank you again for joining us.
And should we acknowledge Joe Clark in the front row coming out? Yes. Yeah. We all owe you a great, in the time when politicians really did make a difference. We remember your contribution. I think we're all touched that you took time to come today. We all learned from you and that you would come and be part of our conversation. Thank you.